Hey everybody, this is Monty Canode, and what a great day this is. We are coming to you from Washington, D.C. today, where Amazon and AWS was hosting the Public Sector Summit. So what a great topic for us to be talking about with your external infrastructure. I'm absolutely thrilled to be going through this top 12 with you all here. We've got some great people who are going to be going through, so you'll get to hear from a couple of our top security engineers. And to get us started off on the right foot, I'm going to turn it over to the Chief Technology Officer, Tony Pelletier. Go ahead, Tony.
Hey, everybody. Tony P. This topic has been something that we've been really excited to talk about, and it's something that we have found to be very dangerous. We're finding a lot of dangerous things in the wild right now. With a lot of the attacks that are going on, the external attack surface is key to your, it is your front door. And if you're leaving it open, attackers are going to find their way in. You know, there's phishing attacks and all those ways to get through the perimeter. And we are becoming a more perimeterless world. But right now, there are things out there in the wild that are being exploited over and over and over again, and they are dangerous. Revil is finding RDP to be one of the most frequently used attack vectors to get into environments, and that's frustrating. The fact that these things that have been around for such a long time are out there in the wild, and it's not a CVE. This is not a 0-day. These are just places where folks are just letting attackers in, and they're finding their way in through their front door. So what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the attack vectors that we have found and we have seen in the environments that we have been in. And I'm really glad that everybody's here to listen through this and hear what we have to say. So Monty, I'll turn it back over to you, brother.
You bet. So thank you very much, Tony. So the key intent here today is to understand your external infrastructure risk. And the reason why this may matter for you, a lot of times people tend to default, and we get asked a lot as a autonomous pen testing company about web applications. And there is a lot more to what your public facing infrastructure is than just the web applications. And so that's why understanding this and understanding that that infrastructure is key to your attack surface is going to be so very critical today. And so these are some of the key points we're going to go over today, and we're going to close it out with a couple ways that, and I say a couple, there are several tips and key things you need to do, and these don't require significant security teams. They don't require significant security tools. These are settings and some of the basics that you can do that will help protect your infrastructure. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it a little bit here. So what are your public facing assets? And maybe the better question is, are you sure? There have been a lot of people who do not realize exactly what they've got on that public facing side. And we have done well over 1,000 pen tests over the last year, more than a lot of different consultant companies. And some of the things that we've found have been a little scary, such as when for one company, when we were doing this, and they're asking us, hey, this server, I don't understand. Where did you get access to this? And this isn't one of our servers. And then they dig a little deeper and find out that this was a special server that was set up for a marketing action back in 2017, and it was just never taken down. And so that's the power of verifying and making sure that the hosts and servers you think are there and are online are. Ports, protocol services, those things like your RDP and 3389 that get abused, data repositories that are public facing and directly connected to the internet. And now even more so, as I said, we're out here at the AWS Public Sector Summit and understanding your cloud environment and assets that are spinning up, spinning down. We're in much more of a constant flow and change. And so really understanding what that change means and what it could be for you with my assets that are online and running, the different net ports protocol services, the data repositories, because they are coming up, going down, let alone that third-party software that you're using to spin them up and down. API connections, we're very integrated, and across all of these are the credentials that are linking it a lot. And so this is what, at this point, this is where I'm going to turn it over to a couple gentlemen who abuse those credentials, abuse some of those things that you're leaving open so that you can get smarter and understand exactly the risk that's out there in your public facing infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zach and Naveem.
Hey folks. Yes, thanks Monty. So I'm going to talk, before we jump into the actual attack vectors, I think one good thing to do is back up and talk about what are we trying to accomplish as a pen tester or as an attacker? And as Monty said, we've run a lot of pen tests. The folks on our team have conducted a lot of external and internal pen tests. And generally speaking, these are the things that we try to accomplish. So number one is seeing if we can breach the perimeter. So essentially starting from the public network, the internet, can we find a path to get into the company's private network? So that could be an on-premises network. It could be AWS, Azure, Rackspace, some data center, any way to pivot from the public network to a private network. And the reason that's so valuable to an attacker is that so much of the sensitive information about a company is on the inside, right? And also, a lot of companies don't protect, for better or worse, their internal networks with the same level of rigor as they do their external networks. So once an attacker is able to penetrate and get into the internal network, they can burrow down, establish persistence, and then start poking around, and a whole new space opens up. So that's goal number one. The second is getting access to sensitive data. At the end of the day, that's what a lot of attackers want. It's all the sensitive data that they can use to ransomware or breach or leak, whatever it is. And that doesn't require breaching the perimeter. A lot of companies, as Monty alluded to, have a lot of data that's just lying out there in the open, and they're not aware of it. And so any way that an attacker or as a pen tester, we can get to sensitive data, whether it's on the inside or just lying out there in the open for anyone to get to, that's another goal that we try to accomplish. Third is compromising critical infrastructure. So here I'm talking about VPNs, for instance, which are basically the front door to your internal network, or mail servers, exchange servers, where a lot of data flows through them. So if you can compromise one of these critical applications that a lot of companies use, that opens the door for massive compromise and damage that can be done as a pen tester. Fourth, related to critical infrastructure, are just applications in general that are exposed on the internet. And these don't have to be hosted by the company. They could be third-party applications, like if you're using, you're hosting WordPress on the WordPress infrastructure, or marketing applications on some other marketing cloud, Salesforce and so forth. So if you can get credentials to access applications that are exposed on the internet, and those happen to have sensitive data, that's another valuable thing that we can accomplish as a pen tester. And lastly, it's compromising the company brand. So this is defacing the public website, or being able to use the company's reputation and brand to launch attacks against other users. So let's say you can host whatever content you want off the company's properties, or launch phishing attacks off the company's domain, or host malware off of there. You can basically piggyback off the company's reputation to do damage to the company and other users that trust what you're doing as an attacker. Monty, can you move forward? So with those goals in mind, we categorize the different types of attacks that we can do. And for this presentation, we're going to talk about those first 5 categories. Social engineering, phishing attacks essentially is important, but our focus here today is on external infrastructure attacks. And what we're seeing a lot of is that more and more these days that, phishing is just one component of all the different range, the range of attacks that are possible. So what we're going to talk about today are different types of credential attacks, essentially ways you can masquerade as a legitimate user to gain access to networks and applications. Data exposure, so data that's just lying out there in the open. Misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, so applications that haven't been set up the right way or haven't followed the best practices, and that attackers can exploit, or vulnerabilities, they're not patched to the latest, and they can be exploited in the same way. And the fifth category we'll talk about is insecure custom web apps. And this is what, we see this a lot as pen testers, is a lot of companies have applications they've developed internally or they've contracted out to some other company. It's not, it's not an application they're selling necessarily. It's just something that they have built for the purpose of their business. And these applications don't have the same level of rigor typically in terms of security practices that you expect from like a third-party application. And so we often find a lot of basic security problems in those kind of applications. So moving forward, let's talk about credential attacks. As Monty alluded to, he talked about the RDP example. These are really, really powerful attacks that happen all the time. So number one is password spray against sensitive ports like RDP. And it's not just RDP, really, it's any port or protocol that enables an attacker to get direct access to a host. If you go to Shodan and just search for RDP, you'll find more than like 4 million RDP ports there. And the reason attackers love this is because it is so easy. Like there's literally just one step you need to do to go from external to internal. You just need to log in. Like you just find a credential. A lot of people don't have strong passwords and you're just in. It's like that's the only thing you need to do. So whether it's RDP, SSH, VNC, SMB, these are all similar in that if an attacker can just guess the right credential, they're into your internal network, and that's it. So it's a very low cost, low hanging fruit kind of approach where attackers can just massively scan all RDP ports and try different usernames and passwords and see what they can get access to. And so if you have RDP exposed on the internet, you can pretty much guarantee that people are trying to constantly spray that. Number two is very similar. Instead of RDP, it's moving to the application layer. So specific applications like VPNs, or if you have web applications that are joined with Active Directory, but you didn't enable MFA, multi-factor authentication on them, that's another target for password spray. So as an example, I'll talk about a lot of examples as we go forward here. We had a client last year that was exposing Jenkins on the internet. And this Jenkins was, the login was joined with Active Directory and there was no MFA enabled. And just using open source intelligence, essentially LinkedIn and other sources, we were able to compile a list of probable usernames at this company. And we also came up with a short list of dumb passwords that we thought could work based on the company name and other variations. So within an hour of attempting various usernames and passwords, we got access as a dozen different users to this application. So it's a really powerful attack if you don't have strong passwords in the first place, and you're joined with Active Directory where there's a lot of different users that could access that application. And in this case, we were able to get into Jenkins. Jenkins, if you're not familiar, is an application that a lot of technology companies use to manage source code and pipelines around deploying source code. So when we got into Jenkins, we were able to eventually figure out that we could actually take over the Jenkins server entirely and pivot into the internal network from there. The third is credentials and breach data. So this is another common vector to find credentials. And a lot of times people mix their personal credentials and their company credentials. And if I were to guess, I think pretty much everyone on this call has had their credentials breached at some point, and it's sitting in some breach database somewhere. That's just the reality of the world we live in today. And people are often not good with their passwords and kind of isolating passwords that they use across different applications. So if you've got a personal password, it happens to be the same as your company password, you can bet that attackers are going to try that on company properties and logins. And even if it's not that exact password, they might try a simple variation of it, because people will, hey, my 90 days has expired. I need to update my password. Let me, update the number from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, right? So that's just typical human behavior. They follow that as well. So this is a really powerful set of attacks. So next category is data exposure. So data exposure is all about just data that you've got lying around for attackers to just take. It's out there, and companies aren't aware that it's out there to begin with. And there's many different vectors for this. We're listing kind of the top 3 here, which are S3 buckets, Git repos, and files sitting on web servers. But there's a lot more. You can have Elasticsearch clusters, you can have storage in Azure, SharePoints, and so forth. But these 3 here we listed are really common. So Amazon S3 buckets, we see it all the time. S3 buckets are kind of like turning into, like, on the internal networks, a lot of companies have large file shares hosted over SMB. S3 buckets are kind of similar, except they're out in the open for the world. And oftentimes S3 buckets start with good intentions. They're meant to be public, they're backing a website, but over time, there's no governance on the data that's actually in the bucket. So more and more data gets added in, and then people just forget that it's out there for the public. And then so sensitive data can show up that way, or people could just forget about the bucket altogether. Git repos, if you're a company that writes source code, then more than likely you've got Git repos. And a lot of companies have public Git repos that anyone can access. So we found a case last year where a company we were doing Pentest for, as an example, they had a zip file checked into a Git repo that was public. We opened up the zip file and we found credentials in there for username and password. And then we poked around at different websites that were exposed publicly by this company. And we were, lo and behold, able to use one of those credentials to access an Apache Airflow server. Apache Airflow, if you're not familiar, is used for a lot of ETL data pipeline kind of management. And it was really critical because there was so much data and disruption we can do from that viewpoint. We also got access to AWS access keys. And it all started with finding credentials lying in the open in a zip file in a Git repo. Files sitting on web servers. This is another big one. We had a company last year that we pen tested, and if you visited one of their websites using the IP address directly, instead of typing in the actual domain, like mycompanydomain.com or whatever, if you just went to the IP directly, we found that we could list all the files that were there. And one of the files was an onboarding document for new employees, and that onboarding document had credentials inside of it. And we were able to use those to do different things. So it's these kind of oversights that are, attackers look for all the time. They're scanning, they're looking for different things. And if they stumble upon this kind of stuff, they can abuse it and do a lot of damage. Related to that, another scenario that just came up recently, we had a client that had a database config file sitting out in the open. And it was for their, we found the config file, it had username and password in there, and we were able to use it to access a production database. So it just wasn't protected. We're at the right ACLs, but it was out there in the public for anyone to use and abuse. Next category is misconfigurations, and this covers, there's tons of stuff to cover here, but we'll talk about 3 big ones. So default credentials. We hear about it all the time with IoT devices. You put this on the internet, it's got default credentials. It also holds true for lots of web applications as well. Last year, client we did a pen test for, we found a site called Jaspersoft. If you guys are familiar, it's a BI business intelligence tool that you can use for reporting and metrics and stuff. We found default credentials to access this. And a lot of people aren't aware, it's kind of undervalued, but the truth is if you get admin credentials to a web application, in many cases, you can use that to then get host access, essentially pivot from that admin to just taking over the server entirely. So there are techniques with Jaspersoft and lots of different applications to take that administrative access and turn it into remote code execution privileges on the server. And we were able to do that in this case. Along the same lines, exposed monitoring or admin panels. We find a lot of cases where DevOps teams, they need to monitor their infrastructure. So they're collecting different metrics like, network utilization, CPU, and all sorts of stuff, process details. And as an attacker, that kind of information, if it's just lying out there in the open, it's really, really valuable. You get so much detail about what's happening that you can then use and pivot and do stuff with. So that's something to be aware of. And a lot of the times these aren't protected with authentication at all. They're just open completely. And so that can be really damaging. The last misconfiguration I'll talk about is subdomain takeover. And this is a really big one. We see this all the time. This is an attack technique where, as an attacker, you can host content off the company's main website. And it looks like legitimate company content. It looks like it's being served from the company's site, but it's actually not. But it looks really scary because it's coming from the company itself. And so the way this works, just to give a quick summary of this, is let's say as a company you want to set up a website, but you don't actually want to do the work of hosting the web server yourself. So you want that to be done by a third party. So you're going to set up your company, website. Let's say it's going to be on mycooldomain.company.com. But now you want to host that website somewhere else, the content for it. So one thing you could do is go to S3 and set up a bucket, and then point your company domain to that bucket using DNS. So basically use a CNAME or alias record to associate your company subdomain to that S3 bucket. Then you put in some content like an index HTML and so forth in that S3 bucket, and you make it public. That's all well and good, but down the road sometime later, you might decide, well, you know what, I don't need this website anymore. So you go and nuke the bucket in AWS. So now that bucket isn't there anymore. So what happens when you go to that company website? It still has a DNS reference back to the S3 bucket. And so you'll get an error saying no such bucket. As a pen tester, if I see this, I love this. Why? Because now I can go create that same bucket and essentially host whatever content I want. You've already done the work of creating the DNS record, tying it to this bucket, and you went and deleted that bucket. So now I can recreate that bucket and basically host content on your website that way, off that same domain that you forgot about. So it's a DNS misconfiguration. We see it all the time, not just S3, but a variety of third-party services. And so there's lots of tools to be able to tell what kind of third-party services allow this in the first place. You would think that AWS would have some protection against it. It doesn't. And there's lots of third parties that allow the same kind of behavior. So, but the root cause is a DNS misconfiguration. So I'll turn it over to Zach to talk through a few more examples.
Hey guys, so I'll go over vulnerabilities. Number 10 is critical CVEs leading to RCE. 2021 has been filled with a lot of really critical remote code execution vulnerabilities that have come out. Microsoft Exchange has had, I think, 4 major vulnerabilities or series of vulnerabilities that have led to remote code execution. Just recently, Microsoft Azure had a RCE against all of their Linux servers that were logging. That was called Omigod. And then also Confluence, that almost everybody that runs Jira and stuff like that, the Atlassian suite, Confluence had an RCE against it too. And so almost all of these servers we found to be hosted externally. So when you breach the perimeter through a 0-day like this, well, in these cases, it's an end day. A lot of people have trouble keeping up with the speed at how fast these vulnerabilities are being found. So security researchers are turning around and releasing the weaponization of these vulnerabilities within days. So that really means that as you as a company, you have less than those like 2 or 3 days to patch your environments to make sure that your perimeters aren't breached. But it's not just the new vulnerabilities and CVEs you have to worry about, we found over the last 2 years that even old ones, I think we found the oldest CVE we found was probably from before 2010, and it was a Ruby on Rails vulnerability that had just been sitting on this client's web server for the better part of, I guess, a decade. And it allowed us to breach their perimeter and get inside, and we were able to pivot in and start probing their internal network. So it really, you got to keep up with what's new, but also you got to keep thinking about and applying good hygiene and making sure that all the old stuff is patched as well. So 11 is server-side request forgery. What does that mean? That means it's a vulnerability class where you can request something from a web server, but it will forward that request into a different place. So say you want to talk to Microsoft Exchange, you send it a request, but this vulnerability class allows you to trick Microsoft Exchange into forwarding that request in somewhere else. So what will happen a lot of times is attackers will look for server-side request forgery vulnerabilities and use that to obtain the AWS metadata tokens. And those tokens allow you to gain privileges into an AWS environment. And depending on the privileges for that token, you can do a whole lot of different things. Go to the next slide. So number 12, insecure custom web apps and broken authentication and access control. Over the last 2 years, we have found so many improperly secured web apps. And most of these are, like Naveen was saying, where a business has a need for a certain type of application. So they either decide to develop it in-house or contract it out. So we found that a lot of these custom applications really are not up to par with the security standards we have today that you'd find from a software vendor. And one of the most common issues we found is that authentication and authorization checks were improperly implemented. So some examples we found for these were, we had a client where they had an API, and the API had an authentication mechanism where you would authenticate and return a token. And then you could pass that token for future requests. But we found that if you would just skip the authentication piece and just send requests with no authentication header, you would be able to get any data you asked for. So there was no check on the authentication. Another example was that one of our clients, they had authentication, but the authorization check only checked the current username and not the actual authentication token that was returned. So basically, by sending a request and saying, I am this user, it would let you perform any action as that user. And it didn't matter if you knew their password or not. So yeah, those are the broken access controls. So what can we do about all of this? So tips to protect yourself. You really need to know your full external footprint. And I'd say in the last 5 years, that picture has become extremely muddy for a lot of organizations. It's not just like what domains do you have out there, what IPs do you have out there. It's really, do you have any shadow IT organization like spinning up GitHub servers or rogue IT assets? Are you properly tracking when users in your organization appear in breach data? And are you informing them that they should change their passwords if they are found in there? Don't expose stuff that doesn't need to be public. This is all about reducing your attack surface. So do you really need RDP listening on that server? Can you manage it from the inside? Or is there some other way you can manage it? Make sure you just manage that attack surface and reduce it as much as you can. Require MFA for all logins. Obviously, we know that not all software does support MFA, but in those cases, you need to be sure that strong passwords are used. But be aware that in breaches, and it's just human nature, people like to reuse passwords. So make sure that it's always a strong password if it's for an application that's exposed externally. Patching. So burn down debt and make sure you keep up with the stuff that's coming out yesterday and the day before. It's a lot to keep up with, but if you can't keep up with it, then you're at risk to being breached on the perimeter. Configuration management process. Really having a process around this will help you also manage what users you have on applications, making sure you don't have old users that shouldn't still be able to accessing stuff, so that say they did have a poor password and they haven't logged in years and somebody ends up guessing it. And so this could help with that. Protecting staging and dev environments too. One of the clients that we worked with, like Naveen was saying, was their staging and dev environment passwords were exposed externally from a GitHub bucket, and it also happened to work in their prod environments too. So making sure that those are secured just as well as prod is important. And upfront security design and testing for custom web apps. Like we were saying, really making sure those authorization and authentication mechanisms are there and that they actually work, so that you don't expose any critical business data to the world.
Thank you very, very much, Zach and Naveen. So this is the moment in the story when we get to go into our aha moments, and that's ask hackers anything. So for anybody who's out there, we've still got a great crowd that's joined us here. I highly encourage you, put any of your questions that you want to ask them about what they've found, how they've executed something. Go ahead and put that in the Q&A if you would like. And we'll go ahead and make that a priority to get back to you with here. I do have one question, because it was brought up by R Evil at the very beginning. They said that they like to brute force and RDP. And so you talked just a little bit about brute forcing, in that you were password guessing. You assembled a number, Naveen, there of different potential users and passwords. Can you just explain a little bit more about brute forcing, and maybe even how password policies can eliminate that or severely, drastically mitigate brute force as an attack vector?
Yeah, I mean, the way password spray and brute forcing works, I mean, to log in, you need two components. One is a username and one is a password. With RDP, in certain cases, a lot of cases, if you don't have NLA, network level authentication, enabled, you can actually get the username for free in a lot of cases, which makes it even more attractive. But let's say you didn't have a username. It's fairly easy to go and use open source tools to accumulate those users. There's so many services out there that provide information about employees at a company. LinkedIn is just one, but if you go to GitHub and look at repos, you can start seeing users on GitHub. There's ways to do it with AWS. There's, if you find a Confluence server, there's vulnerabilities there that let you fully list out all the users that work there. There's probably dozens of different techniques where an attacker can accumulate user names. And from there, try to figure out email addresses as well. So there's lots of services that will tell you a couple of different email addresses for a company. And from there, you can then just get the format of what a typical username or email looks like. Is it first initial, last name, first initial, full first name, last, like those variations. So once you have the username, then it's a matter of compiling a list to password spray against. So passwords. And so there's so many lists out there of common passwords. So typically attackers will start with the simple stuff that's really common. And so if you don't have a good password policy that's blocking these common passwords, you can bet that attackers are going to try them. And going beyond that, attackers that are doing more targeted stuff aren't just going to look at generic password lists. They're going to look at your company and say, okay, your company name is, company. Let's say it's named company. Well, I'm going to try the password company1, company2, company1, exclamation mark, whatever it is, right? They'll look for keywords on your websites. Maybe you have some products out there that you're putting out that you're really proud of, but that's probably something that someone has as a password somewhere. So I'm going to try a variation of that. And so they build these lists of usernames and passwords, and then they'll slowly spray them. They're not going to, there are brute force protections in a lot of applications where you try a certain number of times and then you get stopped, or you can even ban the IP. Attackers are smart enough to have a pool of IPs to try this. They're also smart enough to back off and do it slowly. They don't have to, win in an hour. They can take days and days and days and just do it slowly across. Let's say, they took all the millions of RDP ports out there and had these lists and just slowly were trying it. Eventually they're going to hit, right? And they hit all the time at that scale. So that's in general how it works.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Naveen, for sharing that.
Zach, Brad's asking, if eliminating phishing and credential brute forcing, what would you say after that is the most effective penetration tactic you've employed? And he says, understanding that statistically speaking, that's worth 95% of red team penetration. What are your thoughts there?
I'd say probably the top vector in is just misconfigurations or insecure configurations. And so examples of that would be, like Naveen said, where the web server accidentally served up a database configuration file in a common location, and it had credentials inside of it. Other examples are where a Grafana instance, which is like a DevOps application, had default credentials, and once you were inside, you could use an SSRF vulnerability, and we were able to obtain AWS tokens to enumerate their AWS environment. And then past just general insecure configurations and misconfigurations, I'd say vulnerabilities. So a lot of the vulnerabilities that have come out in the last 3 years have been specifically targeting perimeter assets. So you've gotten tons of CVEs, critical CVEs targeting VPNs, Microsoft Exchange. Really, attackers are going out after the things that are on the perimeter because they understand that once they breach the perimeter, you're really juicy inside. So that'd be my answer.
No, that's a great answer, Brad. I hope that scratched the itch there. He says a follow-on, your org services and products provide a great opportunity to put out your own stats on these. Person would really value your boots on the ground data over time versus surveys and the usual suspects. No, I appreciate that, and I agree. We are beginning to put together those Brad, and we're going to start to push out those reports. We're moving forward. We're moving fast, and we have a lot of data. We have a lot of really interesting data. There's a lot of cool stuff that we just started doing around passwords and some of the passwords that we're able to crack. And there's going to be some really good analysis and statistics on those. So look forward to that. And we're excited for those. Zach, I have a question for you. On the misconfigurations of applications, and Naveen, this is for you as well. On the misconfigurations of applications and things that are on the perimeter, is there something that should be done or something that could be done on the vendor side or in the documentation? Because a lot of that stuff is just, it's not even known until somebody finds it, right? What is the process there?
I think that's a hard question to answer because every organization handles their IT departments differently. We've seen clients that have fully outsourced their IT departments where another company is responsible for standing up the server, configuring the web server, configuring the database on the back end. And we've seen in a lot of cases, those third-party organizations often do it in a insecure way. I'm not saying they're less secure inherently, but a lot of times we've seen in the cases where we found very bad misconfigurations that they were third-party contracted. But in other clients, we found where they do it by themselves, and sometimes they're just as likely to accidentally leave something misconfigured. I think to answer your question on how do you prevent it, it's pretty hard because there's not a one-stop guide where you can just like, here is from start to finish how you deploy an application on a web server for your business. Like every business is different and every business needs to do different things. So I think that complexity is where the misconfigurations become a lot easier because there are no guides for it, and that's how people mess it up.
So it sounds like do penetration testing more often and look for these things on a regular basis is probably the best thing.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot more reactive than proactive, but what you can do is get those configurations and those servers and all your applications deployed in a developed environment, and then have them assessed from a security point of view. Then once they've been assessed, then you can promote them up into production and release them out to the world.
Yeah, I've got, just to add on to that, I would say that there's kind of two kinds of misconfigurations. One kind is where it's just a lazy sysadmin. I don't know how to put it better, but you've put stuff on the internet and you didn't put any authentication behind it. And it's easy for you to do that, but it's not a good thing to do. Or there's some panel that that requires administrative access, like it should be internal, but especially these days with a lot of remote working, you're just going to put it on the internet instead of doing the proper thing of setting up proper authentication or making it go through a VPN. So that's one category of misconfiguration where it's just upfront misconfigured. The second is really around change management. I think a lot of times, like the case where subdomain takeover, where you got S3 buckets that are accumulating data, you're not thinking about that asset as living, and over time, what's happening to it, and if I need, what is the change control process around it? So just having some governance and management of those assets over time is, I think, really important too.
And young IT operators who are just trying to get something up fast, and they want to prove something out. It's a dev environment. This is just dev, and then all of a sudden dev becomes production because now it's being used and it's got super simple passwords, p@55w0rd. I have seen those, and to be completely transparent, I have used those, so I know exactly where that stuff comes from. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Monty.
No,
making fun of me and my password.
Yeah, I'm just surprised. Your transparency is welcome, Tony. That's thank you for sharing that you are human and mortal. So in closing out, and I definitely want to thank Zach and Naveen for sharing some of their stories. These guys have been there doing this. So when they're telling you how they got there and what they found and how to fix it, what could have stopped them, I'll tell you that's invaluable. So I definitely want to thank you guys for sharing that. I want to make sure everybody knows we've got a white paper that you're going to be able to access this. So where we got some question about, hey, capturing some of the data and understanding that at a better level, we've got a white paper that you'll be able to access, and we'll get that link out for everybody here on how to access that on our website. And I just want to close out, since we're at the edge of time, with making a comment to Yi. Yi made the comment and he said, hey, for a multinational large retailer, what are your public facing assets is a hard question to answer. You're right. It may very well be hard, but it is by no means unanswerable. And if you don't know what the answer is, you've got to find out, because actually knowing what your public facing access are, knowing what connections to the internet are, you're going to start to understand, and you're going to have a better appreciation for how you're funneling traffic through those entry points that you want. Because if you don't know what that is, traffic can be coming in from a lot of different places. And that's not a good feeling, because if that is an unknown, you got to get out there and go verify with something like that and really understand what your attack surface looks like. And that's something we can help with. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this Tech Talk. Thank you very much, Tony, for setting the stage up right, and gentlemen, for leading us right. Take care, everybody. And we are out from Washington, D.C. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.